Scotland's history isn't a straight line. It's a pattern of people adapting to a hard landscape, organizing power locally, and surviving pressure from larger sources that tried to control it. Over thousands of years, different societies learned the same lessons in different ways. Coastal routes mattered more than roads. Fortified high ground could decide a season. Control of food, movement, and loyalty mattered more than titles written on parchment. Sometimes that meant resisting empires, sometimes absorbing new cultures, and sometimes reshaping the land itself. One moment captures that pattern clearly: a northern society using terrain and timing to stop a far larger power from pushing any further. To understand how Scotland formed, from its first settlers after the Ice Age, through kingdoms, wars, industry, and into the modern era, we have to start at the beginning, when the land itself was still taking shape. When the ice sheets pulled back, they left a raw landscape of lochs, raised beaches, and open routes from the south and along the Atlantic fringe. Small groups followed these corridors into what would become Scotland, carrying stone tools, fire-making kits, and a memory of coastlines that changed with every generation. They tested new grounds season by season, moving between shore and upland, learning where seals holed out, where salmon ran, and where hazelnuts ripened in dense stands each autumn. Camps left only flint scatter and hearths, but the pattern shows people tracking resources with precision, not wandering aimlessly. Coastlines mattered because they offered predictable food. Shell middens pile up with limpet, mussel, and oyster, mixed with fish bones and burned mammal remains. Along rivers and lochs, people trapped eels and salmon and set up temporary shelters that could be rebuilt after winter floods. In the forests, red deer and wild boar provided meat and bone for tools, while birch and pine served for shelters and boats. Travel by water tied many of these places together, so a light longboat or skin-covered craft could link a summer shore to an inland wintering site. Over time, experiment turned into commitment. Communities began tending plots, first as small clearings, then as fields with boundaries. Forest edges retreated under fire and stone axes. Grain storage pits and charred cereal finds mark a shift from risk spread across many foods to a calendar anchored to sowing and harvest. With crops came tethered lives. People invested in walls, drainage, and paths. Population rose in step with dependable yields, and that pressure encouraged more land clearance and new tools for grinding and cutting. Neolithic building speaks to planning and labor pooled at scale. Chambered tombs, long cairns, and stone circles required hundreds of work hours, a shared timetable, and agreed roles. Alignments towards solstices and equinoxes repeat across sites, suggesting people tracked the sun to regulate farming and ritual. A monument fixed a community's claim to place, and gatherings around it marked seasons, marriages, and funerals. The stones stand as proof that cooperation could be organized and remembered without writing. Nowhere shows this more clearly than Orkney. On these islands, stone replaced timber, so villages and ceremonial centers endured. Houses with box beds, dressers, and stone-built hearths cluster around lanes, while nearby stands a complex of temples and processional ways. Walls were thick, roofs likely turf or thatch, and spaces were laid out with an eye to order and privacy. Craft production flourished. Fine stone tools, grooved ware pottery, and polished axes moved between households and islands, pointing to exchange networks and shared styles. Astronomy shaped how these places were set. Passageways frame winter sunrises, and standing stones bracket the path of summer suns. Builders used horizons, ridges, notches, and sea lines as markers that linked sky events to specific places. Such alignments were more than spectacle. They flagged the turning points that governed when to sow, when to herd, and when to gather. A calendar carried in stone freed people from guesswork and set a rhythm for work and ceremony. One settlement pulls these themes together. Skara Brae predates both Stonehenge and the Great Pyramid of Giza, yet its houses have stone furniture, interlinked passages, and even indoor drainage that channeled waste away from living spaces. It reads like a manual for daily life, where tools are kept, how fire is managed, how neighbors move without stepping into weather. From roaming bands to rooted planners, the arc of these millennia turns on choices made about food, time, and community. And those choices left a map you can still walk today. Iron Age Scotland ran on local alliances and local rivalries. No single ruler set policy across the whole land. Power sat with chieftains who controlled good ground, water, and the manpower to defend both. Their authority rose and fell with the size of their retinues and the safety they could guarantee. Bonds were personal, gifts for loyalty, protection for service, and feasts to seal the deal. When a leader's fortunes dipped, followers moved on, taking skills and weapons with them. That kind of politics made borders soft. Lines on the land shifted with the season, a failed harvest, or a feud that got out of hand. Conflict made sense in that setting. Raiding tested neighbors, restocked herds, and proved a leader's worth. Warfare did not always mean big set-piece battles. Quick strikes at dawn, livestock drives, and ambushes along known paths wore down enemies without much risk. Still, some places had to be held. Hilltops gained rings of ramparts and ditches, with timber palisades crowning the banks. These hill forts worked as lookout posts, strongholds in a crisis, and hubs where tribute was counted and disputes heard. From their high platforms, a chieftain could show strength with stone and timber, and with the viewshed that swept across farms and routes below. Along the north and west coasts, Brochs rose in a different style. Tall, thick-walled towers built of dry stone, they used galleries and stairways worked into the wall's depths. Their entrances were narrow, their interiors compact, and their sites often commanded shorelines or fertile pockets. Some show signs of long occupation with annexes, yards, and outbuildings. Others ended in a controlled takedown, stone carried off and the base carefully leveled, hinting that later groups dismantled them to erase claims or to reuse valuable stone while making a political point. Either way, the message was clear. These buildings signaled status as much as security. Ironworking shifted the economy. Smelters turned bog ore and hematite into blooms that smiths forged into tougher blades and stronger fittings. Plow tips, sickles, and axes lasted longer, so fields could be expanded and managed with less labor. Spears, swords, and riveted shields improved the odds in a fight. Mixed farming backed this toolkit. Cattle and sheep grazed common pastures and winter pens. Barley and wheat filled small fields bounded by banks and dikes. Herds showed wealth in life and in death. Burials and hoards include decorated harness parts and animal bones that speak to feasting tied to status. Houses ranged from dispersed farmsteads with roundhouses and granaries to clustered settlements inside banks. Coastal and island communities often faced both sea lanes and arable patches, letting them farm, fish, and trade. Inland, valleys drew strings of households linked by kin and obligation. Across this patchwork, goods moved. glass beads, Mediterranean-style brooches, and fine metalwork show that people in Scotland tapped routes reaching south into Britain and over the water to the continent. In return went furs, metal, and crafted items. Ideas moved with the goods, new styles in pottery, new forging tricks, and perhaps new cult practices. Belief likely centered on places, waters, animals, and sky. Sacred groves and springs draw repeated offerings. Ritual kept favor with forces that shaped weather and herd health. Rank existed, but it flexed more than later feudal ranks would. In this world, a leader had to fight, host, and give. Military strength kept territory, won allies, and deterred rivals. That balance, local power, defended places, and wide exchange set the stage for the next encounter from the south, where foreign soldiers tested those hilltops and towers. Rome pushed north as part of securing the whole province, not to fold Scotland into a standard civic grid. Commanders tested limits, measured routes, and tried to lock down a defensible line. Their aim was to stabilize the frontier of Britain by checking raids and projecting strength, not to cede colonies and town councils. That strategy shaped what they built and how long they stayed. Where southern Britain filled with planned streets and forums, the north met a rolling front of soldiers, engineers, and surveyors who advanced, paused, and pulled back when the math no longer worked. On the ground, the Roman footprint looked temporary by design. Forts dotted river crossings and ridges, linked by straight military roads that cut across valleys to move units and supplies. Marching camps, laid out fast with ditches and ramparts, appeared in clusters along invasion corridors. You can trace their progress by these earthworks. A fort here to hold a bridge, a camp there marking a night halt, another line beyond showing a further push. The system functioned as a mobile shield, extending reach without the cost of permanent towns. The most ambitious line was the Antonine Wall, thrown across the central belt as Rome's northern boundary at its height. Turf rampart on a stone base, a wide ditch to the north, and a chain of forts and fortlets gave a continuous obstacle with watch over key routes. Even so, it held for a short span. Persistent pressure from the north, the burden of garrisons, and demands elsewhere pulled units back to safer lines. The wall stands as a clear statement of intent and a reminder of limits. Resistance never went quiet. Northern groups adapted faster than Rome could entrench. Warbands knew the passes, the bogs, and the best ambush points along supply paths. They avoided set-piece fights unless the ground favored them. They harassed foragers, drove off animals, and struck at escorts moving grain and gear. Each mile added to Rome's line made that game harder to counter. Long supply routes needed protection, way stations, and wagons, all of which cost money and men. Over time, calculations pointed to withdrawal and redeployment rather than deeper occupation. Economics undercut strategy. Garrisoning forts in rough country meant constant maintenance, rotating units, and paying for transport over land and sea. The expected payoff, secure trade or taxable towns, never materialized at scale. Without a web of civic settlements to anchor culture and commerce, the army had to do almost everything itself. That kept Scotland outside the urbanized, Romanized core that grew in the south. When troops left, they left earthworks and a few road lines, not lasting cities. Yet contact changed the borderlands. Forest shards, glass, and metal goods appear in native sites south of the Highlines, showing selective uptake. People wanted certain tools, ornaments, or vessels, but they kept their own building styles and social rules. Influence ran through exchange and diplomacy more than annexation. When Rome finally stepped back for good, the landscape did not carry forums or theaters. It held fort platforms, marching camp outlines, and roads fading into tracks. Here's the scale of the effort. More than 80 Roman marching camps have been identified in Scotland. The number points to repeated large advances rather than settlement. And those traces set the stage for the polities that would rise in the wake of withdrawal, reading the land in their own terms. After Rome's armies thinned and the frontier lines fell quiet, northern and eastern Scotland saw several power centers rise that outsiders later grouped under one name: the Picts. They did not form a single permanent state. Instead, clusters of kingdoms balanced cooperation with rivalry, each ruled by a king whose standing depended on armed followers, kin ties, and control over key sites. Authority worked through assemblies, tribute, and campaigns that kept borders and reputations intact. When a confederation formed, it rested on bargains struck among elites who knew the cost of failure. We track them through what survives on the ground. Royal and noble households lived beside fortified sites, promontory forts on the coast, hilltops with ramparts inland, and enclosed settlements linked by paths and river routes. These places managed grain, livestock, and craft goods, and acted as rally points in war. The defensive network anchored trade as well. From harbors and crossings, goods moved in and out. Fine metalwork, glass, and wine coming in small amounts, skins, wool, and worked items flowing out. Interaction with neighbors mattered for status, so diplomacy sat alongside raiding, with marriages and hostages helping secure peace when needed. Distinctive stones carry their most striking public messages. Carved symbols, animals, abstract shapes, tools, mirrors, combs, and staffs appear in recurring pairs and sequences. Many stand on routeways or near elite sites, as if marking rights, identities, or obligations. Some stones add scenes of hunting or warfare. Others later combine crosses with the older signs, showing how new beliefs and existing codes met on the same surface. The reputation across regions points to rules of use that communities recognized, even if we cannot fully read them now. Warrior elites supported kingship. Retinues trained for fast movement, knew the passes and fords, and watched rival strongholds. Strongholds such as Burghead on the Moray coast show large-scale timber and rampart construction, suggesting coordinated labor and command. Control over cattle and grain funded campaigns and hospitality. Feasts bound followers, paid craftsmen, and rewarded allied households. When kings pushed outward, they tested neighbors with raids and seized ground that improved access to sea lanes or inland routes. When they faced pressure, they fell back on fortified nodes that covered both coast and interior. Christianity reached Pictish elites through contacts with monastic centers to the west and southeast. Monasteries grew into hubs of learning and craft, producing manuscripts, metalwork, and carved cross slabs. These institutions promoted new rituals and calendars and offered a framework for oath-taking, deal-making, and burial customs that linked distant communities. Their schools trained scribes and artisans who traveled, spreading styles and reinforcing alliances. Over time, ecclesiastical networks stitched regions into a looser shared culture, while kings continued to compete. Across these centuries, Pictish polities held their ground against external domination. They bargained, fought, and absorbed pressure while adapting ideas that fit their goals. Their language faded later as political centers shifted and other tongues rose in court and church, but place names and art styles kept older layers in view. As power consolidated in the early medieval period, some royal seats moved, legal traditions blended, and lineages reworked their claims to fold earlier histories into new frameworks. Pictish symbol stones represent one of the few known non-written communication systems in early medieval Europe, and they still stand where authority once met the road. Dal Riata grew along a sea highway, a Gaelic kingdom with shores on both western Scotland and northeastern Ireland. Its map looked like a chain of headlands, islands, and firths tied together by rowing benches and landing places. Power followed kin. Royal dynasties built authority through pedigree and through control of key harbors and fertile coastal strips. Lineages mattered because they organized defense, labor, and succession. A senior line held kingship, while junior branches held lesser seats and supplied fighters and ships when called. The sea made distance small. Crews in long, clinker-built boats ran regular crossings between Argyll, the Inner Hebrides, and Antrim. These routes worked as roads. News, tribute, and hostages moved along them, and so did monks, artisans, and smiths. Settlements formed as clusters near safe anchorages, with boat sheds, paddocks, and small fields laid out behind. Inland routes still mattered, but authority traveled fastest over water. Control of a narrow sound or a beach with fresh water could tilt the balance in a dispute. Language and custom spread with these voyages. Gaelic speech took root along sea-facing glens and islands, and with it, legal habits, gift-giving norms, and styles of fosterage that bound families across the strait. Law operated through assemblies and oath-taking, recorded in memory and upheld by guarantors. Kingship depended on leadership in war and on the ability to host and reward. A ruler who fed crews, settled quarrels, and returned with booty or tribute kept boats full and followers loyal. Marriage diplomacy stitched rival kindreds into a working order, but the seams could split when a campaign failed. Monastic houses underwrote this system. Foundations connected to Iona and its offshoots trained scribes, kept lineages, and taught reading and chant. Their schools produced clerics who could negotiate, witness agreements, and standardize calendars across scattered shores. Scriptoria and metalworking shops turned out gospel books, reliquaries, and mounts that traveled as gifts and tokens of alliance. Religious leaders advised kings and sometimes arbitrated succession arguments when the stakes threatened wider peace. Craft and art thrived in this environment. Bronzesmiths set red enamel in brooches, bound sword hilts, and fitted decorative mounts to reliquaries. Carvers copied and reworked interlace and animal forms into stone and wood. Manuscript illumination borrowed from and fed into Irish and North British styles, creating a shared visual language that marked status and learning. Objects moved with their owners, so styles spread quickly along the same routes used by fleets. Relations with neighbors swung between treaty and raid. Dal Riata cooperated with Pictish and British rulers when threats pressurized several coasts at once, then clashed over exact control of a peninsula or a sound. Coastal territories were prize and battleground because they controlled staging points and pasture for ship crews. Campaigns often aimed to deny an enemy anchorages or to break a rival's supply by lifting cattle and grain from shore farms. The tempo of conflict matched seasons and sea conditions. Over time, rival powers on both sides of the strait consolidated. As larger kingdoms formed and drew resources inland, Dal Riata's separate strength waned. Yet its imprint proved durable. Gaelic language, legal habits, and church networks remained embedded in Western Scotland and helped frame the political culture that followed. Early medieval Gaelic fleets could mobilize hundreds of oared ships, moving warriors and envoys with speed, and that capacity shaped how kings thought about distance, defense, and rule. Even as centers shifted, the sea lanes stayed open, carrying names, laws, and lineages into the next phase. Raids came first, short strikes on monasteries and stores when the sailing season opened. But the pattern shifted towards settlement as Scandinavian leaders realized that holding harbors and straits produced steady power. The coastline and islands set the rules. Whoever controlled the channels between headlands controlled who ate, who traded, and who could call for help. In that world, a beached fleet could mean rent collected, tribute enforced, or a rival cut off from his winter pasture. Inland hills mattered less than anchorages with fresh water and grazing within a quick walk. Norse strength concentrated in Orkney, Shetland, and the Hebrides, and segments of the western seaboard. There, elites arrived as shipborne landlords, taking dues in kind and demanding service at sea. They built halls near safe landings, marked estates with boundaries, and placed administrators to watch stores and tally livestock. Islands became nodal points. A lord based in Orkney could reach Caithness, Sutherland, and the Faroes on a calendar of winds and currents. A Hebridean war leader could sweep south to the Clyde or west to Ireland when alliances required a show of force. These coasts plugged into a larger North Atlantic system. Ships moved furs, walrus products, iron, and cloth between Norway, the Northern Isles, the Hebrides, Ireland, and beyond. Trade did not run in one direction. Gaelic, Pictish, and British goods and skills circulated with Norse ones, and crews recruited across lines. Information flowed too. News of a storm season, a vacancy in lordship, or a feud that might be exploited. Networks of wintering places and summer thing sites stretched the sea roads into a working economy. Settlers did not erase local communities. They married, fostered children into neighboring kindreds, and struck bargains over grazing, fishing grounds, and tolls. The result was a blended culture visible in farm layouts, dress fasteners, metal styles, and burial habits that mixed older practices with Scandinavian ones. On some headlands, you can find longhouses paired with field systems that carry earlier boundaries. On others, chapels rose near boat shelters, showing how spiritual and maritime calendars overlapped. Sea control dictated strategy. Leaders who held the sounds could move fighters quickly, land at multiple points, and choose when to offer battle. Maintaining crews, hulls, and oars took resources, so estates near the shore produced grain, dairy, and meat for ship service. Settlement followed two tracks: dispersed farming communities in good soils to keep households fed, and fortified or high-status sites at choke points to command movement. A small garrison, backed by a fast flotilla, could dominate a wide arc of coast without occupying every bay. Native rulers adapted. They upgraded coastal defenses, negotiated truces that traded market access for peace, and formed coalitions that could counter a fleet's reach. Some adopted Norse ship types or hired crews to even the odds. Others shifted seat sites inland, but kept eyes on the firths with signal points and patrols. Over time, the balance moved. As families interwove and dynasties split, Norse power fractured. Expanding Scottish kingdoms pressed into the gaps, formalizing lordship where earlier tribute had flowed informally. The language record preserves this era in names like Vic, Bost, Eye, and Ness along shores and islands, a map that still says who once held the sea. Regional differences lasted as well. Island law and custom kept distinct flavors deep into the medieval period, especially where memory ran through thing sites and sea tenures. Orkney and Shetland remained under Norse rule for centuries and were not fully integrated into the Scottish crown until much later, some of the last parts of modern Scotland to leave the Scandinavian political world. The old tribal map thinned as ruling families from Pictland and the Western Gaels stitched together a working order. Marriages bound rival lines, hostages guaranteed peace, and campaigns fixed who owed service where. Out of these bargains rose a monarchy that claimed more than kin loyalty. The title shifted from a personal prize to an office that demanded regular musters, tribute in grain and cattle, and obedience from men who might never see the king in person. That shift marks Alba's arrival as a state that tried to pull most of mainland Scotland into one frame. Authority hardened around land as much as blood. Kings named royal officers to manage estates, levy renders, and watch roads and river fords. Strong points at old hill forts and new enclosures served as collection hubs and assembly grounds. A ruler's power showed in how smoothly these nodes sent food, gear, and fighters when called. Military leadership stayed central because a missed levy or a slow march could let a rival cross a firth or a Norse fleet strip a coast. Loyalty became a negotiated contract backed by oaths and hostages, not a simple inheritance. Language tracked the politics. As courts favored Gaelic, it spread across districts, and with it came legal terms, naming habits, and court ritual that edged out Pictish speech. Place names kept older layers, but daily governance shifted to Gaelic words and scribal habits that standardized records and titles. Over time, distinct Pictish identity faded from the public sphere, even as families with Pictish roots held land and office under new rules that prized the same land, the same strongholds, and many of the same kin networks. Kings leaned on the church to make their claims harder to contest. Patronage founded or re-endowed monasteries, granted lands, and secured prayers for the royal house. Bishops and abbots witnessed charters, taught oath forms, and upheld feast calendars that synchronized distant regions. Christian rites framed inaugurations, penance tempered blood feuds, and burial near shrines signaled sanctioned succession. The altar and the assembly yard worked together, giving rulership both sacred tone and administrative memory. Defense never left the agenda. Norse pressure demanded watch on sea lanes, repair of harbors, and garrisons near ferry points. March routes near Strathclyde and Northumbria needed patrols and bridge control. Kings moved with retinues to inspect, reward, and compel, because presents turned promises into deliveries. There was no fixed capital. Power circulated through royal centers. Scone, Dunkeld, Fortaviat, and others, each stocked to host courts, store tribute, and dispatch orders. Law grew from this motion. Early legal customs, preserved in memory and in brief notes, set tariffs for injury, protocols for hosting the king, and rules for inheritance that limited feuds. Diplomacy framed the borders. Gifts and marriages softened pressure from stronger neighbors, while timely raids reminded weaker ones where obligations lay. Envoys settled tolls at crossings and secured safe passage for traders and clerics because steady exchange supported the royal take. Continuity across reigns brought a stability unknown in earlier centuries of shifting confederations. Offices persisted when rulers died, roads stayed watched, and dues kept flowing. Kings of Alba ruled through constant movement across their territory. Authority depended on showing up, hearing cases, taking hostages, consuming renders on site, rather than resting on a central bureau. Out of that circuit grew the institutions and habits that later medieval Scotland would recognize: a monarchy anchored in land, church-backed legitimacy, and law that could travel as far and as fast as the king's horses. Royal reach grew steadier in this era. Kingship turned from circuit travel alone into a framework that touched most districts at once. Grants of land tied leading families to the crown with clear duties: keep armed riders ready, attend musters, and provide counsel when summoned. Lords built their local followings on these tenures, and in return, the king counted on named men to hold bridges, guard passes, and collect renders. The old habit of authority moving with the ruler did not vanish, but it now linked into a web of obligations that stayed in place when he rode away. Feudal customs shaped daily power. Charters fixed who owed what, in service days, in grain, and in coin. Wardship and marriage rights let the crown steer inheritances and keep fortresses in safe hands during minorities. Sheriffs and moormares stood out as anchors. The sheriff managing royal pleas and revenue in the shire, the great provincial lord coordinating wider levies. When a dispute rose beyond a township, it climbed to these offices, and through them to the king. Record-keeping sharpened memories. Rolls and brieves traveled between courts so orders did not depend on a single hearing. Stone castles marked a shift in warfare and control. Timber ramparts gave way to towers with gatehouses, vaults, and thick walls set to command a ferry, a road, or a rich floodplain. A tower house and bailey could host garrisons year-round and store grain gathered as rent. Building in stone cost labor and money, but it signaled permanence and made sieges slower, which bought time for relief forces. Around these strongholds, nucleated settlements formed, drawing smiths, millers, and traders under a lord's protection and the crown's oversight. Administration widened its reach. Royal justicars toured to hear serious cases. Local courts handled land transfers, assaults, and debt. Written law codes and case notes circulated with clerks trained by the church. Standard forms made judgments legible across distances, which encouraged more people to bring claims rather than settle by feud alone. Many rulers spent more days outdoors on circuits of justice than seated in halls, turning law into a public performance that reinforced their presence. Ecclesiastical power expanded alongside the crown. Monasteries controlled broad estates and ran granges that introduced better plowing, drainage, and stock breeding. Cathedral chapters educated clerks who staffed chanceries and taught account keeping. Tithes moved produce into church barns, while sanctuary, marriage rules, and burial customs gave clergy influence over key life stages. Patronage linked altar and throne. A grant of land to a house of canons could secure prayers, literate staff, and a loyal local network. Burghs changed the economy. Kings fixed markets with privileges on tolls, weights, and courts. Merchants traded wool, hides, fish, and salt outward, and imported cloth, wine, and metal goods from the Low Countries and France. Guild rules kept standards, while customs on exports and entry dues fed the royal purse. As legal islands, burghs drew settlers seeking predictable law, which increased tax flows and diversified skills in towns that became regional hubs. Diplomacy and marriage policy managed external risk. Treaties set ransoms, border watches, and safe conducts. Unions tied families across frontiers. Architecture, manuscript work, and church art tracked these links, Yet the legal system and offices kept a distinct cadence. Strains remained: noble feuds, famine years, and pressure from neighbors. But by the late 13th century, the machinery of kingship worked, even as dynastic uncertainty left the question of succession open. A fall from a horse ended a reign and left no adult to step in. The crown sat empty while guardians tried to keep order, but the center no longer held. Local power filled the gap. Great families looked first to their own borders, their own fortresses, and their own clients. Road tolls, musters, and courts that had worked under royal supervision now depended on who showed up with men and seals. Without a settled successor, even routine disputes ran hotter because every judgment could tilt future claims. Law offered no single roadmap. Custom had guided past handovers, but it relied on clarity about heirs and consensus among magnates. This time, both were missing. Legal arguments multiplied around blood ties, fosterage, marriage contracts, and earlier promises. Clerks set out pedigrees and produced charters to prove who stood closest and right, but each text met a countertext. The more the elites argued, the more each district drifted into its own orbit, guarded by stone keeps and sworn bands. Claimants multiplied. Senior lines advanced their champions. Junior branches revived sidelined links. Foreign ties added weight to some cases and suspicion to others. Factions formed around veterans, sheriffs, bishops, and castle holders who could deliver levies or shut gates. Each party counted who controlled key bridges, ports, and grain-rich lowlands. Alliances shifted when a host failed to appear on a set day or when a promised dowry did not arrive. The map turned into a puzzle of overlapping oaths and temporary deals. Government lost reach. Sheriffs hesitated to act without clear backing. Revenues stalled as tenants waited to see who would claim them. Judges deferred verdicts in hard cases, afraid to offend the next ruler. Lesser quarrels turned into sieges of small towers as neighbors tested how far they could push. Coin clipped in local hoards speaks to anxiety and the need to pay men quickly. Along the marches, patrols shortened their circuits, and cross-border theft rose. Invisibility invited outside leverage. Letters and envoys moved across frontiers with offers of mediation or support, offers that came with string. Some nobles saw arbitration as a way to avoid civil war. Others feared a loss of freedom under the guise of order. Yet with every delay, the risk grew that a decision would be made beyond Scotland's own courts. Independence began to hinge not on battlefield defeat, but on whether internal agreement could be reached in time. Efforts at arbitration set precedents. Procedures for hearing claims, weighing documents, and staging public assent evolved under pressure. The process taught elites how to formalize what custom had kept flexible. It also exposed weaknesses: the lack of binding rules for minority kings, the danger of divided regencies, and the ease with which strongholds could defy paper warrants. Kingship itself became a question to answer, not a fact to accept. The dispute did not resolve cleanly. It lingered into armed contests, embargoes, and campaigns that scarred border shires and strained treasuries. At one point, more than a dozen individuals formally claimed the throne, an extraordinary number for medieval Europe. The next phase would grow from these fractures, as armies tested claims that charters could not settle, and as guardians haggled over hostages, ransoms, and winter garrisons. War opened when struggle over succession collapsed into outside arbitration and then armed entry. The claim of overlordship turned mediation into orders, and orders into an invasion that treated Scotland as a wayward fief rather than a prize for annexation. Garrisons marched north along known corridors, testing bridges, fords, and coastal landings. The strategy aimed to seize levers of obedience, towns that levied customs, castles that stored grain, and courts that issued writs, so that resistance could be recast as defiance of a superior rather than defense of a realm. The first months exposed how thin feudal mobilization could be without clear command. Many tenants by night owed service on paper but lacked horses, mail, or pay. Musters failed to converge, and some lords weighed their odds and stayed neutral. Others accepted terms, opened gates, and kept their men intact for later. The result was a patchwork of occupied pockets and live redoubts, with main roads held, but backcountry routes still in local hands. Where castles fell quickly, it was often from negotiation or short blockades rather than long sieges. Resistance built from the ground up. Local leaders leaned on kin, parish networks, and forest commons to gather food, scouts, and guides. Rather than chase set battles, they worked the terrain. Columns found roads cut by felled trees, bridges lifted, and pack animals driven off the night before a march. Convoys faced darting attacks at river bends and defiles, where a few dozen fighters could break order and then vanish into moor and wood. Some Scottish forces avoided pitched battles entirely, using ambushes and choke points in ways that feel closer to later small war handbooks than to knightly warfare. Control of stone and stores shaped every week of the war. Castles became more than symbols. They were silos of grain, nodes for writs, and safe rooms for hostages. Towns on the coastal plain paid customs that kept garrisons fed. Whoever held bridgeheads on the Tay and Forth could tax traffic and move quickly between shires. Supply lines mattered more than banners. A single failed convoy could starve a fort and reopen a district to revolt, which made escorts as important as the walls they served. The strain reached farms first. Fields went untilled where men guarded passes or hid cattle from requisitions. Markets shrank when merchants feared confiscation on the road. Lowland parishes, rich in oats and grazing, met repeated levies, fines, and foraging, which pushed laborers to hedge living in woods and hills. Hoarding and clipped coin spread, not from greed, but from uncertainty about who would claim dues next month. Even compliant districts bore double costs, feeding their own and feeding the army that claimed to protect them. Leadership changed as fortunes swung. Captains who brought off a raid or retook a keep gained followers. Those beaten in the open saw allies drift. Names rose, fell, and rose again as guardians reorganized, exiles returned with new pledges, and local notables tested the wind. Alongside fighting, envoys sought recognition abroad, because a seal from a foreign court could turn a victory into sovereignty. That chase for legitimacy mattered as much as any skirmish, since it promised treaties, trade, and a future beyond garrisons. Occupation without local consent proved brittle. Garrisons could hold roads, but they could not turn harvests or silence parish bells. By the end of this phase, Scotland remained contested, yet the conflict had forged tighter habits of cooperation and a sharper sense of common interest that would shape the struggle to come. Bruce began with almost no base to stand on. His claim faced rivals, excommunication, and garrisons across key towns and castles. Many magnates withheld support, hedging until someone could hold a winter without losing men or ground. That reality forced him to work like a commander on the run, not a settled king. He rode short circuits through friendly glens, shifted hiding places, and leaned on local clerics and kindreds who could raise a night's food, a guide, or a ferry at low tide. Survival came first. Ceremony waited. Early defeats taught him to move faster and strike smaller. He kept corps of mounted men who knew byways and burns, cutting through forests and moss to avoid patrol lines. When a castle could not be held, he refused to garrison it, preferring open country to traps behind walls. Promises were personal and specific. A cow levy forgiven here, a hostage returned there, a marriage settled to bind a doubtful lord. He built loyalty by solving local problems, while the larger war stormed past. Consolidation followed as he removed or neutralized rivals. Some opponents died in skirmishes, others lost lands or retreated into exile. Estates changed hands to reward people who supplied boats, fodder, or gate keys at the right hour. He rebuilt leadership with men tested in raids who could command small columns, keep silence, and deliver on timelines. That cadre replaced the older habit of slow musters and fragile conditions. Orders traveled hand to hand, not just on parchment. Operations shifted toward choking the enemy's reach. Rather than chase large armies, Bruce targeted fords, bridges, and the roads that fed castles. He struck convoys, burned siege equipment, and lifted cattle out of districts pledged to his foes. Key strongholds fell by surprise or blockade. Once taken, many were slighted, walls toppled, wells spoiled, beams burnt, so they could not be used again. He kept the field and denied fixed points to the other side, turning Scotland into a moving front that favored his strengths. Holding the realm meant ending feuds as much as beating foreign garrisons. He called councils to settle blood prices, reassigned disputed estates, and brokered guardianship for miners whose lands sat on vital routes. Church backing helped. Patronage funded altars, confirmed rites, and tied abbots and bishops to the royal cause. Religious legitimacy steadied oaths, framed pardons, and gave cover to magnates who needed a reason to switch. Abroad, he pressed for recognition that matched facts on the ground. Envoys worked treaties, sought safe conducts, and used seals to turn truce lines into borders. Independence became the point of every negotiation, because legal standing promised trade, brides, and fewer pretexts for invasion. As raids turned to control, farms recovered. With fewer foraging parties on the move, seed grain stayed in barns and plow teams returned to heavy soils. Customs revived in burghs, sheriffs counted dues, and writs reached farther without escort. Kingship took on a new meaning under him. It leaned on consent, law carried in circuit, and the idea of a realm defended by its people rather than a lineage alone. Procedures for counsel, for ransom, and for emergency levies hardened into practice. Those habits outlived him. The settlement, land grants, church alliances, and a working court held shape after his death. Scotland left his reign more knit together than it had been for generations. Its fortresses largely unusable to an invader by deliberate design. Its roads watched by men who had learned to keep a realm alive while they destroyed the very walls that once defined it. The war reignited the moment a child king inherited Bruce's crown. Guardians governed in his name while veteran nobles jostled for leverage, testing the settlement that had held through his reign. Claimants with old pedigrees read the uncertainty as an invitation. They raised banners, assembled affinities, and pressed cases that had never fully died. The dynastic map looked crowded again, and every great household had to choose a side or risk being chosen for one. Outside powers stepped in with money, ships, and protection for preferred rivals. They cast the struggle as unfinished business from earlier successions, arguing that previous decisions were flawed or coerced. Envoys moved between courts while captains crossed the sea with men-at-arms, making the political argument with steel. Invasions came in waves, timed to coincide with internal dissent, so a raid on the coast echoed with a feud in the lowlands. When one army withdrew, a claimants' council met, and the cycle repeated. Castles turned into the real measure of control. Whoever held the stone towers held the rent rolls and the harvest barns, the hostages and the road gates. Siege engines returned to prominence, and so did starvation as a tactic. Garrisons challenged allegiance under pressure or after patient blockade. Towns that sat astride river crossings took on an outsized importance. A single bridge could determine who could tax a valley. Scotland's leaders prioritized the line of lawful kingship over expansion. Their aim was not to annex neighbors, but to make the realm coherent enough to survive. Charters reaffirmed rights. Parliaments, when they could be gathered safely, endorsed guardians and regents. Oaths bound earls and bishops to the king's name, even when the king could not stand among them. The work looked slow, but it created a habit of consultation that outlived the battles. The cost landed on ordinary people. Extraordinary levies funded winter campaigns. Fields burned during chevauchées, turning cattle herds into moving coin for whichever army arrived first. Conscription and hostage-taking tore labor from farms just as sowing or harvest approached. Rebuilding stalled because each season might bring another march. Markets shrank, rents were unpaid, and local courts struggled to sit without a mounted escort. Diplomacy became the second front. Letters carried pleas for recognition to continental rulers and church authorities. Ambassadors argued that legitimacy rested on prior settlements and lawful acclamation. Safe conducts were negotiated so prisoners could be exchanged without fresh fighting. Truces bought harvest time, even if they barely lasted a season. The prize was a line in a treaty naming Scotland independent and the monarch lawful, so future invaders would face not only spears, but signatures. The Long War slowed reform that administrators had planned since Bruce's later years. Standardizing coinage, surveying estates, and strengthening sheriff courts all lagged. Yet repeated councils hardened cooperation among magnates. Families that had feuded learned the price of going their own way while foreign banners flew at their harbors. When critical votes came, enough of them chose unity for the realm to hold. Scotland finished the struggle still self-ruled, but thinner in people and poorer in stock. The monarchy, though tested, proved that a network of guardians, councils, and written assent could keep a crown stable across storms. And in several stretches, the king governed from abroad, relying on couriers, seals, and loyal nobles to carry orders over moor and firth, a kingdom run at a distance, yet still recognizably whole. A new house took the throne after years of war, and that alone felt like relief. The Stewarts offered a clear line of descent that courts and councils could rally around. Crowns passed from father to son more predictably than before, even when a child wore it. Stability did not mean quiet. Power still ran through great lordships in the west, the northeast, and the borders. Kings bargained with magnates who controlled musters, rents, and justice on their own lands. That dependence shaped daily rule. The court traded charters for service, confirming earldoms and baronies in return for oaths and armed followings. Grants brought short-term loyalty and long-term problems, because each patent added to a noble's local clout. When rival families squared off, sheriffs hesitated, and royal writ reached only as far as a household guard could ride. Feuds did not end with a truce. They paused, shifted, and resumed when a minority king made the crown look vulnerable. Minorities happened often. A king too young to hold a sword meant regents, guardians, and competing councils. Government continued on parchment and under seals, but direction wobbled. Taxation stalled in one shire while another pushed through tallies. Embassies left on schedule, yet policy tilted with each faction's rise. The court learned to manage by consensus, gather the lords, win their names on a document, and move the machinery one notch forward. Even in that climate, the country built. Stone churches rose on older timber sites. Colleges and song schools trained clerks who filled chanceries and kept accounts. Poets worked at court, and masons refined a style that blended local tastes with workmen arriving from abroad. The court became a hub where artists, jurists, and clerics found patronage, and where visitors noticed that Scotland looked and sounded more connected to continental fashions than it had a century earlier. Foreign policy mattered because neighbors mattered. Alliances on the continent shaped who supplied arms, who offered safe harbors, and who might mediate a dispute with England when raids along the marches threatened to spiral. Marriage plans doubled as treaty drafts. A princess matched to a foreign prince could open trade or promise military aid. Those ties were bargains, not guarantees, and they required constant tending. The church anchored much of this world. Bishops sat on councils, abbots managed vast estates, and ecclesiastical courts handled a wide range of disputes. Royal power leaned on that network. Prelates helped legitimize settlements and carried messages across regions where lay authority was tangled. At the same time, clerical privilege could shield local interests against the crown, complicating attempts to standardize law. Administration expanded step by step. Auditors checked royal income, clerks compiled registers of charters, justices on circuit tried to make statutes felt beyond the core lowland heartlands. Enforcement remained uneven. A strong monarch could push reforms through. A weak one watched them slide back when magnates refused cooperation. The lesson, repeated across reigns, was that law gained teeth only when the leading families accepted it as useful. Across these generations, the dynasty held. Succession continued, councils met, and royal ritual framed politics even when discipline frayed. The era set habits of consultation and resistance that later constitutional battles would test. And the most striking scene of all came early in the story. A Stewart king crowned as a child, too young to speak, ruling for years through regions, while scribes wrote in his name and nobles enforced his seal in the shires. She came to the throne as a newborn, so regents carried the crown's weight while Scotland shifted under their feet. Councils met to approve taxes, appoint officers, and steer foreign policy, but authority moved unevenly from region to region. Lords in the west guarded their own kirks and courts. Burgh councils in the east watched trade and customs. The government held together by seals, oaths, and routine, even as those routines were being rewritten by new religious rules and local power brokers who read the moment as permission to act first and seek approval later. The Reformation pressed into daily life through parish pulpits, new ordinances, and the redirection of church lands. Monasteries lost income and influence. Preachers gained a platform that rivaled royal proclamations. As old clerical revenues were reassigned, Noble families built their own networks of patronage from confiscated rents. That financial shift weakened traditional levers of kingship, because distributing offices and stipends had long been a way to win obedience. Now, the crown competed with lay patrons who could fund allies straight from former ecclesiastical estates. Mary's Catholic faith set a permanent fault line between her and many of the men she needed. Councils could agree to a truce in doctrine for a season, but local enforcement followed the will of whichever constable, minister, or laird stood nearest. The court worked to balance household officers across factions, yet trust ran short. Invitations to council were read as signals of favor. Exclusions triggered plots in the hallways. Every proclamation had to consider how it would sound in a Protestant sermon the following Sunday. Her long absences narrowed her reach. Decisions made abroad required patient translation into Scottish conditions, where kinship and proximity outweighed neat policy. By the time instructions traveled back, alignments inside the realm had already shifted. Governors and secretaries stood in for royal presence, but their signatures carried less force in regions where neighbors enforced the law, and kin guarded passes more effectively than any officer could manage. Marriage policies aimed to map Scotland into a safer alliance pattern, yet personal unions deepened suspicion. Each match threatened a faction's standing, so rival councils fought to control the terms, dowries, and future guardianship of any heirs. Letters moved fast. Trust did not. Within months, allies became critics, and critics armed their tenants. The government struggled to keep the courts sitting while lords measured the odds of moving first. Rebellions grew from these strains. Some rose to challenge ministers and favorites rather than Mary herself, but each rising chipped away at royal standing. Negotiated pardons kept the peace in the short term and taught rebels that leverage worked. As councils gained confidence, formal power flowed toward them. Sessions met more frequently, Kirk discipline hardened, and the preaching calendar became a political schedule. Royal proclamations had to share space with synod decisions that shaped behavior, property disputes, and public order. The breaking point came when nobles forced an abdication that placed the crown on her infant son. Governance passed into the hands of regents who backed Protestant policy across offices and courts. Mary's removal fixed the new religious settlement inside state structures. Clerical authority and noble management worked in tandem under the banner of order. Held in confinement for years, she influenced Scotland only through the fears and hopes she produced in other capitals. Even then, she remained a factor in strategy, a claimant whose presence affected treaties, marriages, and border policy. She died abroad after long captivity, and the factions that once arranged her life now arranged their parliaments without her shadow on the agenda. When the Scottish king inherited the English crown, two realms found themselves under one ruler without becoming one country. Laws, parliaments, and churches stayed separate, so authority split across two sets of institutions that did not answer to each other. The monarch now had two royal styles, two councils, and two sets of priorities to juggle. That legal separation mattered in daily governance. Statuses passed in London did not automatically reach Edinburgh, and Scottish acts did not bind English courts. Each realm maintained its own legal officers, its own procedures for appeals, and its own tax rules. The court's center of gravity moved south. With the royal household based in London, Scottish councils relied on couriers, petitions, and set audiences to get decisions. Access to the king turned into a matter of miles and calendars. A case that might have once been heard during a royal progress in the lowlands now depended on secretaries who could secure a slot in a busy English schedule. Patronage followed the palace. Offices, pensions, and monopolies clustered around the place where the ruler slept and held council. English population and wealth tilted policy. Larger revenues and a more complex fiscal system gave English concerns priority in budgeting and war planning. Scottish projects that needed crown cash waited longer and often asked private magnates to bridge the gap. That imbalance encouraged Scottish nobles to seek positions in the wider royal sphere. Families promoted sons for posts at the southern court, negotiated English marriages, and bid for commercial privileges that could lift a burgh's trade or a clan's finances. Scotland's foreign stance narrowed. A shared monarch meant solo diplomacy looked like disobedience. Ambassadors now spoke for a composite kingship, so Scottish interests competed inside the same brief as English ones. Ports that once welcomed envoys directly now worked through joint instructions. Neutrality became harder to sustain when one part of the king's dominions faced pressure abroad. Frictions grew at home. Governance questions turned on who had the right to set taxes, reform church discipline, or command forces along the borders. Ministers, presbyters, and nobles tested the edges of authority, citing the old laws of the realm to defend local practice against innovations rumored to come from the south. The arrangement produced gray zones rather than clear lines. Did a royal proclamation made in London bind Scots if it lacked ratification in Edinburgh? Could a policy shaped by English bishops fit a church that had its own courts and confessions? Cultural habits did not dissolve. Language, law terms, and ritual remained distinct. A royal mile away from a parish kirk, Scots law still used its own writs and remedies, and burgh merchants kept their trading customs. The shared monarch did not erase a sense of nationhood. If anything, the constant comparison sharpened it, as poets, jurists, and ministers argued for the worth of local forms. Over time, the setup prepared paths toward deeper union, joint planning for defense, talks about customs barriers, and experiments with common councils. But every step forward drew backlash from those who read any harmonizing measure as a loss of hard-won autonomy. Resentment simmered in episodes of unrest that drew strength from this constitutional half-light. And the most striking detail of the whole period sat at the top. Once he wore both crowns, the ruler never came back to live in Scotland, issuing orders from London while Scottish seals and session courts did the daily work of a kingdom that remained its own. The fight over church governance tipped into a national crisis when new canons and service books arrived with royal backing. Parishes, guilds, and presbyteries rejected what they saw as centralized control over worship and discipline. Elders met in packed kirks, town councils debated enforcement, and printers spread arguments at speed. What began as protests over forms of worship widened into a contest about who held authority in Scotland: bishops appointed from above, or assemblies and courts rooted in the congregations that funded and attended them. A national agreement bound nobles, ministers, burgh leaders, and ordinary householders to a shared religious settlement. Signatures multiplied across shires, creating a network that could summon men, money, and attention faster than any royal proclamation. The movement organized committees to inspect garrisons, supervise printing, and coordinate supply. That coordination turned belief into leverage. Envoys stated policy with a clarity that came from collective backing, and local officers moved in step because their neighbors had pledged to the same terms. Events in England and Ireland opened the field further. Scotland was no longer a bystander, but a player whose armies and councils could tip outcomes across the Isles. Cross-border negotiations linked military aid to recognition of Scottish church structures. When talks failed, marching columns spoke the argument. Armies moved with chaplains and commissioners, making decisions that mixed strategy with doctrine. Camp sermons and council orders shaped the same day's work. The campaigns stretched from defensive posts in the lowlands to expeditions beyond the Tweed. Logistics set the pace: magazines at key burghs, ferries at river crossings, and harvest schedules that decided when regiments could muster. Control of ports in the east mattered for powder and salt. Control of upland passes mattered for cattle and fodder. Roads that connected market towns turned into lifelines for coin, bread, and medical supplies. Whoever held the bridges could keep an army fed through winter. Alliances frayed as victories and defeats shifted confidence. Groups that had agreed on church order split on how far to push royal policy, how to treat prisoners, and whether to bargain for peace. Leaders who had shared pulpits and committees now kept separate councils. Strategies diverged. Some pressed for strict terms, others for settlements that promised stability even at the cost of principle. The result was a front line that ran through meeting halls as surely as across fields. The strain on the economy grew with each levy. Farm stock vanished into commissary lists. Coastal trade faced blockades and seizures. Tenants fled contested zones, leaving rents uncollected and fields half-sown. Courts could not sit in districts where troops wintered, so disputes piled up and feuds revived under cover of marching feet. Parish relief funds tried to bridge the gap and ran dry. Royal authority slipped as assemblies, committees, and military councils made decisions once reserved for a crowned head. Later, foreign forces entered and imposed direct military rule, issuing orders without reference to a Scottish parliament that could not meet. Older institutions bent or broke under ordinance. Sheriffs, bailies, and session clerks found themselves answering to quartermasters and provost marshals. For a period, Scotland was governed without a king, without a sitting parliament, and under occupation, a stark compression of power into barracks and headquarters. When the campaigns finally ended, the realm was intact on the map, but drained. Armories held more paper than powder, treasuries more tallies than coin. The habits of committee rules survived, yet the means to enforce them did not. The next chapter opened on a country that needed bread, credit, and time more than speeches, and whose leaders counted the cost in lost tenants, empty barns, and silent looms. The Jacobite cause tried to reverse a political settlement by bringing back the old royal line. Support clustered unevenly. Highland clans in the western seaboard and parts of the northeast could raise men faster and keep them in the field longer. Burghs in the lowlands often stayed cautious, keeping trade open and taxes steady rather than risking confiscation. That map of allegiance shaped every decision: where to land arms, which glens to rally in, and which roads to avoid. Local loyalties determined whether a messenger passed safely or vanished at a ford. Foreign courts treated the unrest as leverage. Aid offers came with conditions on timing and objectives, and they depended on wars that had nothing to do with Scotland's internal disputes. When France faced pressure overseas, shipments shrank. When diplomacy looked favorable, promises grew. Jacobite councils tried to align a domestic timetable with the rhythm of continental campaigns. That meant pauses before bold moves, or sudden marches to match a rumor of incoming ships. Military strength drew on clan structures. Chiefs could call tenants and kin, producing battalions built from neighboring farms. That cohesion made for quick assembly and strong morale in the first weeks. It also meant supply chains leaned on cattle, meal, and local credit, which ran thin if a campaign stretched into winter. External assistance added powder, officers, and sometimes coin, but it arrived irregularly. Leaders had to balance speed against logistics, knowing that a long wait for foreign help drained support at home. Disputes inside the movement never fully closed. Some wanted a march south to force a decision. Others argued for consolidating control in key regions. There were arguments over command, over whether to hold towns, and over how to treat those who would not swear. Each choice carried political costs. A hard policy alienated fence-sitters. A soft one emboldened opponents. Councils changed shape as fortunes shifted, and messages to allies abroad offered one plan while field commanders adopted another. Government forces adapted. They improved musters, mapped routes, and developed an intelligence network that tracked gatherings before they turned into armies. Garrisons at key bridges and passes shortened response times. Regular drill, supply magazines, and better coordination between militia and line units reduced the shock of sudden raids. Over time, the state learned how to intercept couriers, monitor ports, and pressure landlords who might shelter recruits. Defeat of the last rising ended open war. The state moved to prevent renewal by targeting the structures that had raised men. Land tenure changed under new rules that tied obligations to the central government instead of to a chief's command. Courts broadened the offenses that carried penalties for mustering or carrying arms. Military districts oversaw daily life in whole regions, with officers deciding movement, markets, and gatherings. That system made ordinary tasks, moving cattle, attending a fair, subject to inspection. Central authority reached valleys that had operated on custom and kin arbitration. New roads linked forts. Schools and legal officers encouraged the language and practices favored by the state. Dress, music, and gatherings associated with raising men faced restrictions or oversight. Some customs moved into controlled displays. Others went quiet to avoid fines, or worse. Trade followed the new roads, and lowland towns tightened their economic pull. By the end, the political center of gravity rested more firmly in the lowlands, and Highland power operated within narrower lines. Regions once semi-autonomous became parts of an integrated system that recorded movement, taxed more consistently, and expected compliance. After the final rising, whole districts lived under military control, and the Highlands learned that authority now traveled fast along new roads, with orders that left little room for the old ways to decide the next step. Factories, lecture halls, and crowded tenements reshaped Scotland in tandem, so ideas and industry moved together. Universities revised curricula toward practical science, moral philosophy, and mathematics that served commerce and administration. Publishers printed affordable textbooks and journals, pushing debates beyond faculty rooms into workshops and clubs. Bankers standardized credit instruments that let merchants fund coal pits, textile mills, and ironworks at new scale. The pace altered daily life. Bells marked shifts, steam marked horizons, and town councils wrestled with growth that refused to pause for planning. Innovation came from a broad bench. Engineers refined rotary motion and high-pressure systems that multiplied output in mills along the Clyde and in Lanarkshire pits. Naval architects tested hull forms and iron plating that kept shipyards booked for years. Surgeons and anatomists improved clinical methods alongside public health boards that tracked outbreaks with better statistics. Economists studied trade cycles and wages, giving legislators language to debate tariffs, poor relief, and currency stability. The result was a feedback loop. Inquiry produced tools, and tools created new questions. Schools expanded to supply literate workers for counting houses, drafting rooms, and railway offices. Parish schooling improved attendance. Burgh academies added modern languages and bookkeeping. Mechanics institutes ran evening classes for apprentices. Literacy made newspapers and pamphlets ubiquitous, so strikes, new inventions, and municipal votes spread quickly through print. Skilled labor moved where wages rose, and families calculated the value of sending a child from farm work into clerking or spinning. Cities concentrated production. Glasgow grew around cotton, and then heavy engineering. The Clyde's banks turned into a corridor of foundries, boiler shops, and slipways. Dundee spun jute with imported fibers and local ingenuity. Aberdeen mixed fishing, granite, and shipbuilding. The Central Belt dug coal and smelted iron to feed rails and bridges. As headcounts climbed, rural parishes lost people. Highland and lowland villages watched tenants depart, some to nearby towns, others to colonial ports. Estates reorganized agriculture, consolidated holdings, and linked output to urban markets by carrier roads and later by rail. Global connections widened. Merchants tied exports to shipping lanes that reached imperial depots and foreign harbors. Profit flowed in both directions. Capital went out as surveyors, accountants, and engineers, while raw materials and orders returned. That reach amplified inequality. Owners and skilled foremen prospered. Dockers, miners, and mill hands rode wage swings and layoffs tied to distant market shocks. Insurance offices, joint stock companies, and new banks spread risk for investors without removing it from workers' tables. Infrastructure stitched the country. Canals moved coal and stone before railways overtook them with speed and volume. Ports dredged deeper channels and added cranes. Telegraphs paralleled tracks, shrinking decision times for brokers, editors, and station masters. With movement eased, ideas and strikes could leap from town to town as fast as goods. Urban life paid a price. Overcrowded closes and alleys funneled smoke and sewage. Water and drainage projects lagged behind headcounts until boards of health forced upgrades. Factory heat and dust shortened lives. Accidents in mines and yards pushed families into parish relief. Workers organized. Friendly societies pooled dues. Unions negotiated hours and pay. Marches pressed councils for sanitation, housing, and schooling. Incremental laws on factory hours, mine safety, and education shifted conditions, while philanthropists and cooperators opened libraries, baths, and model dwellings. Invention never really stopped. Shipyards launched armored vessels and fast liners. Marine engines grew reliable at sea. Chemical works produced dyes and alkalis. Electrical firms wired streetlights and tram lines. Yet from the late 19th century, international competitors undercut costs, new steel centers drew orders away, and recessions exposed dependence on a narrow industrial base. Some firms adapted with specialized products. Others closed. Communities lived with the aftershocks for generations. During the height of this arc, A small nation supplied an outsized share of the world's engineers, shipbuilders, and industrial inventors, a workforce and knowledge pool that left marks on canals, railways, harbors, and factories far from home. The 20th century opened with Scotland tightly tied to global markets and imperial routes, then saw those links pull it into total war twice. Shipyards, steelworks, and engineering firms switched to armaments, while regiments mobilized across towns and islands. Losses tore gaps in families and trades. Women moved into factories, transport, and hospitals, altering the labor mix and expectations about pay and welfare. After demobilization, the state expanded pensions, health schemes, and housing programs to manage the social shock and prevent a return to pre-war insecurity. Industrial contraction followed over decades, not months. Orders for ships and heavy machinery fell as competitors rose and new materials shifted demand. Coal pits and steel plants closed in clusters, leaving corridors of unemployment from the Clyde to Fife and Ayrshire. Communities built around a single yard or pit faced long job searches, retraining schemes that did not match local skills, and a housing stock that needed investment. Outmigration increased, with younger workers heading south or overseas, while councils negotiated enterprise zones and subsidies to attract replacement firms. Government took on a larger role. Welfare and health services broadened under a national framework, and post-war housing replaced slums with new schemes that aimed at modern amenities but often lacked local services and transport. Planning authorities rezoned land for industry and ring roads, changing the shape of cities. Public corporations managed energy, transport, and parts of manufacturing, then moved through privatization waves that reshaped ownership without instantly fixing productivity gaps. A cultural revival ran alongside these changes. Writers, musicians, and broadcasters paid close attention to language and place. Gaelic and Scots received new support in schools and media. Heritage groups cataloged archives, mills, and shipyards, while new museums presented industrial memory as part of national identity. Festivals drew visitors to older towns and rural areas, linking culture to local economies. Politics turned toward constitutional questions. Debates over how decisions were made, local, national, or shared, grew sharper as economic restructuring continued. Campaigns argued that domestic control over health, education, transport, and parts of taxation could align policy better with local needs. A devolved parliament returned lawmaking capacity in key areas, creating committees, budgets, and oversight mechanisms that reshaped how public services operated. Parties adjusted, and voters weighed performance in Edinburgh as well as in wider unions. The economy diversified. Finance, higher education, and digital services grew in and around major cities. Life sciences, advanced manufacturing, and creative industries linked universities to startups and multinationals. North Sea oil and gas brought revenue, jobs, and technical expertise, supporting supply chains from fabrication yards to software firms. As fields matured, policy shifted toward a longer energy transition, and companies redeployed skills into grid management, storage, and offshore construction. Renewables moved from pilot projects to strategy. Onshore wind expanded across uplands. Offshore wind arrays scaled in deeper waters. Tidal and hydro kept a steady share. Grid upgrades, interconnectors, and storage projects followed. Training centers retooled workers from oil, shipbuilding, and civil engineering into turbine maintenance and subsea cabling. In recent years, generation has exceeded domestic consumption, placing the energy sector at the center of planning and international links. Through these developments, membership and alignment within larger political unions remained a core issue. Trade rules, migration policy, fisheries, and research funding shaped choices for firms and universities. Public debate widened to include social equality, representation, and regional balance, with an attention to housing costs, health outcomes, and transport links. Modern Scotland operates in global networks while maintaining distinct legal, educational, and civic institutions. And the agenda keeps returning to how power, resources, and responsibility should be shared in the decades ahead. Scotland's history is a story of survival, transformation, and enduring identity that continues to shape the nation today. If you enjoyed this complete journey through Scotland's past, subscribe for more deep dive history videos like this one.